The drought-choked canyons of the San Juan Territory in 1887 choked the skies with ash and forced desperate alliances over dwindling water. Isolated homesteads cling to jagged ridges, divided by unspoken tensions between cattle syndicates, displaced families, and outlaw factions. Blood soaked through Willa's sleeves as she dragged a shattered stranger toward the cellar hatch, tearing splintered boards aside to bury him. The old gunshot wound along her ribs flared hot, a permanent reminder of the night her mother fell to her father's gang. Beneath the stranger's torn coat rested a dented silver badge, catching the lantern glow with a weight that made her breath catch. Heavy boots thundered across the porch, and her father's desperate voice cracked through the floorboards, demanding she hide the enemy before the posse breached the door. She could drop the timber and let the lawman bleed, or slide him a rusted canteen and turn her back on the only loyalty she had ever known. That single choice would fracture her family's reign or cost her everything she was. Blood soaked through Willa's sleeves as she dragged the shattered stranger across the warped floorboards. Her boots slipped on the dust-choked planks, but she locked her knees and pulled, hauling his dead weight toward the dark square of the cellar hatch. The canyon wind howled outside, carrying the dry stench of burning sage and distant powder smoke. She tore the heavy pine boards aside with bleeding fingernails, each splinter catching the rough wool of her skirts. The trapdoor groaned under the strain, hinges rusted shut by years of neglect and silence. She did not look at his face. She only looked at the dark. Heavy spurs struck the porch outside, iron ringing against warped timber. The rhythmic thud of approaching boots sent a cold tremor down her spine, familiar and suffocating. Her father's voice cracked through the floor above, sharp and frayed with panic. "Hide him, seal the wood, do not speak." She knew that tone. It was the same voice that had ordered the burning of the mercantile, the same voice that had left her mother's shawl draped over an empty chair. Willa swallowed the dust in her throat and shoved the stranger's boots over the edge. His body tumbled into the crawlspace with a dull, breathless thud. She grabbed a rusted iron hook and dragged the heavy timber back into place. Darkness swallowed them both. The air beneath the house smelled of damp earth and dried blood. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, lantern light bleeding through the cracks in the boards above, painting thin golden lines across the stranger's ruined coat. Her hands moved on instinct, tearing strips of linen from her apron, wrapping them tight around the torn flesh of his left arm. The fabric darkened instantly. His breathing came in shallow, ragged pulls, each one rattling against his ribs. She reached to steady him, and her fingers brushed something hard beneath his lapel. Metal, cold, she pulled it free. A dented silver badge caught the sliver of lantern glow, worn smooth by years of hard writing and harder choices. Her breath caught. The old gunshot wound along her own ribs flared hot, a sudden familiar burn that traced the exact spot where her father's bullet had grazed her years ago. She turned the badge over in her palm. The weight of it felt like a stone dropped into still water. Beneath the stranger's coat, half tucked against his ribs, rested a leather-bound ledger. She slid it free with careful fingers, wiping away the dried mud on the cover. The pages were thick with names, dates, and coordinates. Her own family's name sat at the top of the final column, circled in heavy charcoal ink. Next to it lay a list of supply routes, water claims, and homestead deeds marked for seizure. This was not a random outlaw running from a posse. This was a lawman who had walked straight into a massacre, and he was bleeding out on her dirt floor because her father had ordered his death. Footsteps paced above. The floorboards bowed under a heavy weight. Her father's shadow stretched across the cracks, blocking the light. He leaned close to the trapdoor, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that vibrated through the timber. "You still down there, Willa? The Marshal's riding hard. I need you quiet, need you loyal." She pressed her palm flat against the wood, feeling the vibration of his boots. The ledger sat heavy in her other hand. She could hear the distant crack of rifle fire echoing across the canyon walls, closer now, moving with the wind. The posse was hunting, her father was hiding, and she was caught between them, kneeling in the dark with a choice that would burn her name from this valley forever. The stranger's fingers twitched against her wrist, weak but deliberate. His eyes opened in the gloom, clouded with pain but sharp with recognition. He did not speak. He only nodded toward the ledger, then toward the floor above. A silent plea, a silent warning. She looked at the silver badge, then at the rusted water canteen resting near her boots. She knew what happened to those who turned their backs on the Vance name. She had seen the rope. She had seen the empty chairs. She had seen the way her father's men looked at her when she asked too many questions. Loyalty was survival. Mercy was a luxury for softer times, but the heat in the crawl space felt different now. It felt like a line drawn in the dirt, waiting to be crossed. She uncorked the canteen and poured a thin stream of water over her hands, washing the blood from the stranger's wound with steady, deliberate motions. She pressed a clean bandage against his shoulder, feeling his breath slow just a fraction. Then she slid the ledger back beneath his coat, hidden from sight, and pulled his torn collar up over his face. Above her, her father shifted, his boots scraping toward the door. The posse would breach the ridge in minutes. The law would come. The guns would fire. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees, and placed her hand flat against the iron latch. She could open it. She could call out. She could hand the lawman over to save her own skin. Instead, she turned the latch the other way, wedging a heavy wooden brace against the hinge, sealing him inside, sealing herself in. The wood groaned. The dust settled. And the quiet that followed felt heavier than a bullet. The dust from the sealed trapdoor still hung in the lantern light, thick and heavy, when the floorboards above groaned under a new weight. Willa stayed on her knees, her palm flat against the rough pine, listening to the slow, deliberate descent of boots down the cellar stairs. Each step carried the familiar scrape of leather soles against warped wood. She knew that gait. She knew the heavy breathing that followed. Sela's Rurk, her father's shadow. The man who had tied her mother's shawl to a fence post after the ranch burned. He stopped at the bottom step, his silhouette cutting the dim light, his hand resting on the worn walnut grip of his Colt. The hammer clicked back just once, a sharp metallic snap that echoed in the cramped space. "You hear me, girl." The posse is riding hard down the eastern ridge. Your father wants the cellar clear. He wants the boards nailed down. He wants no traces. Willa did not look up. She kept her eyes on the dirt floor, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. The old wound along her ribs pulsed in time with her heartbeat, a hot, familiar ache. She remembered the night the ridge fire started. She remembered the smell of burning wool and the sound of her father's voice giving orders in the dark. Loyalty was a heavy coat. It kept you warm, it also kept you bound. "I hear you, Sela's." Her voice was quiet, flat, measured. He stepped closer, the toe of his boot nudging a loose plank. "You look tired. Tired eyes make mistakes. Mistakes get people hang." He leaned down, the smell of cheap tobacco and gun oil filling the narrow gap between them. "You know what happens when you shelter a lawman. They don't just hang you, they hang your name. They drag your father's legacy through the dirt. They make an example of the blood." Willa finally lifted her head. The lantern light caught the dust on her cheeks, the tight line of her jaw. She looked at the revolver. She looked at his face. The lines around his eyes were deep, hardened. He was not a monster. He was a man who had chosen survival over conscience and lived with the weight of it every day. "I know what happens, Sela's." He held her gaze for a long moment. The hammer stayed cocked. Then he exhaled, slow and ragged. "Clear it, before sundown. If the Marshal's men find him under your roof, they'll burn this cabin to the ash line. They'll take you to Fort Stanton, and they won't ask questions." He turned, his boots heavy on the stairs, and climbed back toward the main floor. The door above slammed shut. The latch clicked. Willa stayed still. The silence returned, heavier than before. It pressed against her ears. It pressed against her chest. She looked down at the trapdoor. Beneath it, a faint, wet sound. The stranger was breathing, shallow, ragged. She placed her hand on the iron latch. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, from the weight of the choice. She could walk away. She could leave him to the dust. She could let the law take him and keep her family's name clean, but the badge was in her coat pocket. Cold, heavy. It felt like a stone dropped into a still pond. She remembered the ledger. The names, the coordinates, the list of homesteads marked for seizure, her father's signature at the bottom of the final page. She lifted the latch just an inch, the wood groaned. She slipped her hand through the gap. The air below was damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and old iron. She reached into her apron and pulled out a rusted tin canteen. The water inside was warm, tainted with dust. She uncorked it and let a thin stream fall through the crack. It landed on the dirt with a soft hiss. A moment passed, then another. A weak hand emerged from the darkness. Fingers wrapped around the canteen. The grip was firm, surprisingly steady. It held her wrist just for a second, a silent anchor. A quiet acknowledgement. The stranger did not speak. He only squeezed her wrist once, then let go. Willa felt the tremor in her own hand still. She slid the canteen through. She listened to him drink. The sound of swallowing was slow, deliberate. It bought her time. It bought her breath. She knew what came next. She knew the risk. She pulled a narrow bone folder from her belt, the same tool her mother had used to stitch saddle leather. She slipped it through the gap. She reached beneath the coat. Her fingers brushed rough wool. Then leather. Then paper, thick, stiff, stained with mud and dried blood. She gripped the edges of the ledger, pulled. The pages slid free with a soft tear. She drew back. The trapdoor closed. She sat in the dirt, the stolen pages pressed against her chest. They felt alive. They felt dangerous. They felt like a line drawn in the dirt. Above her, boots paced the floor. Silas was still there, watching, waiting. She heard the scratch of a match, the flare of sulfur, the slow burn of a cigar he was smoking. He was thinking. He knew she was hiding something. He just didn't know what. The wind outside shifted. A low whistle threaded through the eaves. It carried a new sound. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. Horns, Poss horns, blowing in short, sharp bursts. The law was closing the ridge. The hunt had turned. Willa pressed the ledger pages into her coat. She tied them tight with a strip of rawhide. She stood. Her knees ached. Her ribs burned. She looked at the trapdoor one last time. The stranger's breathing had steadied. He was alive for now. But alive was not enough. Not when the walls were closing in. Not when her father's name was carved into every stolen deed. She turned toward the back wall, the loose stone, the hidden crawl space that led to the timberline. She had used it as a child to escape the shouting, to hide the tears. She pulled the stone free. Dust fell. Cool air rushed in. It smelled of pine and coming rain. She slipped inside. The stone scraped shut behind her. The dark swallowed her, and the hunt began. The timberline waited like a bruised wall against the storm-dark sky. Willa moved through it with her head down, her shoulders tight, her boots sinking deep into the ash-choked soil. The wind tore through the pines, carrying the dry scent of burning brush and distant powder smoke. She kept her hands close to her sides, feeling the rigid outline of the ledger pages against her ribs. They pressed against her skin, hard, unyielding. Every step was a calculation, every branch a potential alarm. She remembered the Marshal's whisper before she closed the door. Follow the dry wash past the split cedar, keep left at the rusted wire, climb to the ridge mine, do not look back. She followed the wash. The ground sloped downward, slick with loose shale and dried creek beds. The rain had not fallen in weeks, but the storm was coming. The sky bruised purple at the edges. Thunder rumbled low in the distance like wagon wheels over hard-packed earth. She moved faster. Her breath came in short pulls. The old wound along her ribs flared with each stride. She ignored it. Pain was a familiar companion. It kept her sharp. It kept her moving. A snap echoed to her right. She froze, pressed flat against a boulder. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. She waited. The wind carried the sound again, hoofbeats, heavy, deliberate, not a posse, too few, too quiet, her father's scouts. They were tracking the wash. They were tracking her. She slipped behind a cluster of dead brush, her eyes adjusted to the gloom. The fog was rolling down from the high ridges, thick and cold, swallowing the trees one by one. It muffled sound. It blurred edges. It made the world feel smaller, more dangerous. She watched two riders emerge from the mist. Their coats were dark wool. Their hats pulled low. They carried Winchester rifles across their saddles. They moved with the practiced ease of men who knew the land, who knew the traps. Willa held her breath. She counted their passes. 1, 2, 3. They turned toward the eastern fork. Away from her, she exhaled, slow, controlled. She stepped out from the brush. Her boots found solid ground again. She pushed forward. The wash narrowed. The walls rose steep. The ground grew slick with loose rock and dry leaves. She slipped once, caught herself on a root. Her palms stung. She kept moving. The storm broke overhead without warning. Rain fell in heavy sheets, cold, relentless. It soaked through her coat in seconds. It plastered her hair to her face. It turned the ash to mud. She wiped her eyes, kept her head down. The wind howled through the canyon. It carried another sound. Sharp, metallic. Gunfire, a single shot. echoing off the stone walls, then another, closer. They were not firing at her, they were firing at something ahead or behind. She could not tell. She pressed her back against a dead pine, listened. The rain masked everything. It made direction impossible. It made survival a blind guess. She pushed off the tree, moved faster. The trail wound upward, toward the ridge, toward the mine. Her legs burned, her lungs ached. The mud sucked at her boots with every step. She climbed. The ground grew steeper, the trees thinned. The sky opened above her, gray, heavy, full of lightning. She reached the crest. The old mine entrance waited, a black mouth carved into the rock. Timber supports rotted and leaning, tracks rusted into the stone. She stepped inside. The air cooled instantly. It smelled of damp wood and old iron. She pressed her back against the wall, listened, nothing, just the rain, just the wind, just her own breathing. She let her shoulders drop just an inch. Then the ground trembled, not from thunder, from hooves, multiple, approaching fast. She turned toward the entrance. Two riders appeared at the edge of the timber, not her father's men, different coats, different hats, lawmen, marshals. They dismounted quickly, drew their weapons, fanned out. One of them shouted, voice carrying over the rain, "Come out, we know you're in there, drop your weapons, step into the light." Willa did not move, she stayed against the wall, her hand tightened around the knife. Her other hand pressed against the ledger pages. She knew what they wanted. She knew what they would do. They would arrest her. They would hang her. They would burn her name, but they would also take the pages. They would bury the truth. She heard boots on gravel, slow, deliberate, closing in. She closed her eyes, felt the rain drip from the ceiling, felt the cold seep through her coat, felt the weight of the choice. Then the sky split open. A jagged line of white lightning struck the dry brush outside the entrance. The fire ignited instantly, a wall of orange and black. Heat rolled inward. Smoke choked the air. The marshals shouted, stepped back, drew their coats over their faces. The fire spread fast, hungry. It cut off the entrance. It trapped her inside. It forced a decision. She turned toward the back of the mine. The old drainage tunnel, narrow, flooded in places. She had heard about it from the men who worked the ridge, from the stories they told in the dark. It led to the creek. It led out. She ran. The tunnel swallowed her. The water rose to her knees, cold, shocking. It stole her breath. It numbed her legs. She pushed forward. The current fought her. The dark pressed in. She kept moving. Her hands brushed the walls, rough stone, slick mud. She slipped, went under, swallowed water, coughed, pushed up, kept moving. The fire crackled behind her. The marshals' voices faded. The hunt lost its sound. The water rose higher to her waist, to her chest. She fought the current, fought the cold, fought the dark. Her lungs burned, her muscles shook. She saw a faint light ahead, gray, diffused, moonlight filtering through an opening. She pushed toward it, her hands broke the surface. She pulled herself up, dragged her body over wet rock, collapsed on the bank, gasping, shaking, alive. The creek ran wide and fast below her. It had swallowed the scent. It had scrambled the trail. It had reset the hunt. She lay on the wet stone for a long moment. The rain softened. The wind died down. The fire burned itself out on the ridge. Silence returned, heavy, quiet. She sat up slowly, wiped water from her face, looked ahead. The timberline opened into a narrow valley. Beyond it, the old homestead road. Beyond that, the county seat. Beyond that, the truth. She stood. Her legs trembled. Her coat weighed 50 pounds. Her ribs ached. But she moved forward, one step, then another. The ledger pages pressed against her chest. Cold, heavy. Alive, she was no longer just a daughter hiding beneath the floor. She was a woman carrying a valley's future in her coat, and the road ahead would not forgive hesitation. It would not forgive fear. It would only forgive the truth. She adjusted her collar, set her jaw, and walked into the dark. If you rode with me this far, you know the weight she carries. The ridge fire is dead. The creek swallowed the tracks. The ledger presses against her ribs, cold and heavy, and the road ahead only demands the truth. If this journey speaks to you, tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me exactly where you're watching from. I want to know how far this trail has carried us. Because past the timberline, the storm hasn't finished. The mine entrance waits like a closed mouth. Deputies stand in the rain, rifles rest on tired hands. And Willa will have to answer for the blood on her sleeves, not with a gun, but with the quiet weight of a choice that will either break her or bend the valley. Step back into the dark with me. The water from the creek clung to her boots like wet iron. Willa dragged herself up the slick bank, her breath tearing through her throat in ragged, shallow pulls. The storm had broken the heat, but the cold rushed in to replace it, biting through the soaked wool of her coat and settling deep into her bones. She wiped rain from her eyes with the back of her wrist. The ledger pages pressed against her ribs, heavy and damp, a constant reminder of what she carried. The mud sucked at her soles with every step. She moved toward the timberline, keeping her head down, her shoulders tight against the wind. The ridge ahead rose sharp against the bruised sky. The old mine entrance waded in the rock like a closed mouth. She did not know what lay beyond it. She only knew she could not go back. The sound of boots on gravel cut through the rain. Sharp, deliberate, not the scattered pace of a fleeing rider, the measured tread of men who knew how to hold ground. Willa stopped, pressed her back against a rain-slicked pine. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. She counted the footsteps. 3, 4, 5. They emerged from the mist at the edge of the clearing. Rain darkened their coats, hats pulled low against the wind, Winchester rifles cradled in their arms, barrels pointed down but ready. Deputy captains, federal men, the kind who wore exhaustion in their posture and carried the valley's violence in their eyes. They did not see her at first. They swept the tree line, moving with practiced caution, reading the mud for tracks. Then one of them shifted. His boot turned toward her hiding place. The barrel of his rifle rose, smooth, quiet, final step out, keep your hands where we can see them. Willa did not move. The rain fell harder. It plastered her hair to her cheeks. It ran in thin lines down her neck. She felt the cold settle into the old scar along her ribs, a dull, familiar ache. She thought of the trapdoor, the dark, the stranger's hand on her wrist. She thought of her father's voice cracking through the floorboards. She thought of the names written in charcoal ink. She let go of the knife. She stepped out from the tree, raised her hands, slow, steady. The deputies fanned out. The rain drummed against their hats. The captain stepped forward. His face was lined, weathered, eyes the color of wet stone. He looked at her sleeves. At the dried blood turned dark by the rain, he looked at the satchel strapped across her chest. You're carrying Vance property. His voice was flat, stripped of ceremony. You step into the open, you drop the bag, you tell me what you know, or you walk into the creek and don't come up. Willa lowered her hands slowly. She did not drop the satchel. She let the strap dig into her shoulder. The leather creaked in the damp air. I know what it is. Her voice was quiet, clear. It carried over the rain without strain. I know who wrote the names. I know where the water claims are marked. I know the supply routes. I know the homesteads. The captain's eyes narrowed. He did not raise his rifle higher. He did not lower it either. His thumb rested near the hammer. His boots shifted in the mud. You're a Vance. The name alone hangs half the valley. If you're carrying that bag, you're carrying a noose. Drop it. I won't ask twice. She felt the weight of the ledger against her coat. She felt the cold in her lungs. She looked at the captain. She did not blink. My father's men took the Miller claim yesterday. They burned the fences. They scattered the cattle. They left the deed nailed to the well post. The next raid hits the eastern ridge by sundown. 3 families, 2 water wells. No law between here and Fort Stanton to stop it. I'm not running with it. I'm running from them. The rain fell heavier. The wind shifted through the pines. The captain did not speak for a long moment. He watched her hands. He watched her shoulders. He watched the way she stood, not defiant, not broken. Just steady, a frontier truth wearing an outlaw's coat. You expect me to take your word. A daughter's word over a gang's ledger, over my own orders. She shook her head once. Slow, I don't expect anything. I'm telling you what will happen. If you wait for the posse to ride in, the valley burns. If you wait for the law to catch up, the families bleed. I walked through the wash. I slipped the pages from a dying man's coat. I dragged myself out of the creek because I couldn't watch another mother stand in an empty doorway and wait for smoke. The captain's jaw tightened. His thumb moved away from the hammer just a fraction. The rifle lowered an inch. The barrel pointed at the mud. Rain washed over his boots. It washed over her sleeves. It washed the dried blood into thin pink streaks that vanished into the dirt. He exhaled. Slow, measured. You're either the bravest fool in this territory or the only one left with a spine. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. You drop that satchel, I take you to Fort Stanton. You keep it, you walk out of this woods, and the next man who sees it won't ask questions. They'll shoot first. I'm not asking you to like it. I'm asking you to choose. Willa felt the strap bite deeper into her shoulder. She felt the cold in her fingers. She thought of the stranger's grip. The quiet plea in the dark, the badge in her pocket, the weight of a name she never chose. I'm not walking to the fort, and I'm not running to my father's door. She kept her voice level, plain, unadorned. I'm walking to the Ridge Road. I'm putting these pages where the families can read them. I'm ending the seizure orders before the sun drops. You can shoot me here, or you can let me pass. The captain watched her. The rain fell between them. The deputies shifted. Rifles stayed steady. The wind carried a new sound, distant, faint, but unmistakable, hoofbeats not scattered, not fleeing, coordinated, closing in from the eastern tree line. The captain's head turned, just slightly. His eyes narrowed. The sound grew louder, hooves on wet stone, leather creaking, breathing steady, men who knew how to track, men who knew how to hunt, her father's scouts. They had found the wash, they had found the creek, they had found the mine. The captain's hand moved back to the rifle. The barrel rose. Just an inch, we're boxed. His voice dropped to a rough whisper. They'll be in the clearing in 3 minutes. If you walk out there with that satchel, they'll cut you down before you clear the pines. If you stay, they burn this ridge. If you run, they track you to the county. There's no clean path. Willa felt the rain soak through her hair. She felt the mud pull at her boots. She felt the ledger press against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She looked at the captain. She looked at the deputies. She looked at the tree line. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. The wind shifted again. It carried the scent of wet wool, gun oil, smoke. The captain's jaw set. He did not lower the rifle. He did not raise it. He just stood in the rain, waiting. Willa stepped forward just one pace, then another. Her boots sank into the mud. Her shoulders stayed square. She did not look back. She walked toward the tree line, toward the sound, toward the storm. The captain's breath caught. The deputies shifted. Rifles tracked her movement, but no one fired. The rain fell. The wind howled. The hoofbeats broke through the pines. Shadows emerged, dark, still, waiting. Willa kept walking, one step, then another. The rain washed the dirt from her face. The ledger stayed tight against her chest. The world narrowed to the space between her boots and the tree line, to the sound of approaching boots, to the weight of a choice that would either break her or bend the valley. She did not stop. She did not turn. She walked into the clearing, and the storm opened its throat. The first rider broke through the mist. Coat dark with rain, hat pulled low, rifle across his saddle. He reined in hard, mud sprayed. He saw her, saw the deputies, saw the captain's rifle. He did not draw, he just sat, waiting. Behind him, more riders emerged, not her father's men, not scouts, law, federal coats, worn badges, rain-slicked rifles. They moved with the quiet authority of men who had walked this valley too long to fear it. At their center rode a man who carried his stillness like a weapon, Marshal Elias Thorne. His coat hung heavy. His face was carved by years of wind and powder smoke. His eyes missed nothing. He dismounted slowly. Boots hit the mud with a solid thud. He walked forward. Rain fell on his shoulders. Water ran down the brim of his hat. He stopped 3 paces from Willa. He looked at her sleeves. At the satchel, at the mud on her boots. He did not reach for his revolver. He did not raise his voice. He just stood in the rain, in the quiet, in the space between blood and law. You carried it. His voice was low, rough, stripped of ceremony. Through the wash, through the creek, through the storm. She nodded once. I did. He looked at the captain. The captain lowered his rifle just a fraction. Thorne turned back to her. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy iron chain. It glinted in the gray light. Attached to it was a pair of iron cuffs. And at the end of the chain, kneeling in the mud, was a man she knew too well. Sila's Rurk scout, beaten, silent, eyes down, shoulders tight. His wrists were bound, his coat was torn, his breath came in shallow pulls. He had been found. Broken, waiting, Thorne did not look at him. He looked at Willa. He pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket. It was old, worn smooth by years of use. It caught the dull light, cold, heavy, real. He held it out, palm up. Rain fell on his fingers. This opens the strongbox at the county seat. The deeds, the water claims, the land grants. The Vance name is carved into every page. You turn that key, the valley shifts. You leave it in your coat. The raid happens by sundown. He did not blink. He did not look away. You wanted to stop the slaughter. Stop it. I'm giving you the tool. I'm not giving you permission. I'm not giving you protection. I'm giving you the weight. Willa stared at the key. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her breath caught in her throat. The rain fell. The wind shifted. The mud pulled at her boots. She thought of the trapdoor, the dark, the stranger's hand, the badge in her pocket, the names written in charcoal, the families waiting for smoke. She thought of her father's voice, the spurs on the porch, the heavy timber, the quiet choice that sealed her fate. She reached out, slow, steady. Her fingers brushed the iron. It was cold, heavier than it looked. It felt like a stone dropped into a still pond. She closed her hand around it. The key sat in her palm, solid, unforgiving, real. Thorne stepped back just an inch. The rain fell between them. He looked at the captain, at the deputies, at the scout in the mud. He did not raise his voice. He did not give orders. He just spoke, clear, heavy, measured. Your father's men won't stop. The posse will be at the canyon fork by dawn. They'll come for the satchel. They'll come for the key. They'll come for you. You walk out there with this and there's no turning back. You walk away and the valley burns. You carry the weight and you bear the cost. It will not be clean. It will not be easy. It will be yours. Willa closed her fingers around the key. It bit into her palm. The rain washed over her knuckles. The ledger pressed against her ribs. The scout knelt in the mud. The captain stood in the rain. The deputies held their rifles. The wind carried the scent of wet stone, of coming dawn, of a storm that would not break. She did not speak. She did not nod. She just turned toward the road, toward the county, toward the strongbox, toward the truth. Her boots sank into the mud. Her shoulders stayed square. The rain fell. The wind howled. The hoofbeats faded. The clearing emptied. She walked alone. The key sat heavy in her coat. The ledger pressed against her heart. The valley waited. The sun had not risen. The raid had not begun. The choice had been made, and the road ahead would not forgive hesitation. It would not forgive fear. It would only forgive the truth. She adjusted her collar, set her jaw, kept walking, one step, then another. The dark opened before her. The storm broke above. The dawn waited beyond the ridge. She stepped into it. And the weight of the valley settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, as a covenant. She did not look back. She only moved forward, into the center of the storm, into the quiet, into the cost, and the road carried her. Toward the strongbox, toward the names, toward the end of a legacy built on fear, toward the beginning of a valley that would finally breathe. The dust on the courthouse steps had baked into a pale, cracked sheet under the midday sun. Heat rose in visible waves from the boardwalk, warping the air above the wooden railings and blurring the edges of the waiting men. Willa stood at the center of the square, the leather satchel heavy against her hip, the iron key cold in her palm. The county seat was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that held its breath. Boots shifted on gravel, leather creaked. A horse stamped, kicking up a thin plume of dry earth. On the left side of the steps, the Marshal's men stood in a loose line. Rifles rested at their sides, barrels pointed down, eyes fixed forward. On the right, her father's riders formed a rough crescent. Dust coated their boots. Sweat darkened their collars. Hands hovered near holsters. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the wind dragging across the ridge, carrying the dry scent of sage and old smoke. Willa stepped forward. Her boots struck the first wooden step. The sound was sharp in the stillness. She climbed, one step, two, three. The wood groaned under her weight. She reached the landing, turned, faced them. The satchel strap bit into her shoulder. The ledger pressed against her ribs like a second spine. She unfastened the leather flap. Her fingers trembled just once. Then they steadied. She pulled the ledger free. The pages were thick, stained, bound in rough twine. She opened it to the center. Her father's name sat at the top of the column. Dark ink, heavy strokes. Next to it, the Miller claim, the Carson well, the Ridge homesteads, all marked. All waiting, she felt the old scar along her ribs pull tight. A familiar burn. She remembered the trapdoor, the dark, the stranger's grip. She remembered the canteen, the rusted latch, the choice that had sealed her fate. She closed her eyes for a breath, then she opened them. She pulled a match from her coat pocket, struck it against the step. The flame caught, bright, sudden, alive. She held it over the page. The paper curled. The ink blackened. The fire spread, slow at first. Then hungry, it ate the names. It ate the coordinates. It ate the ledger of a valley built on stolen ground. Ash lifted into the hot air, gray flakes drifting, falling. The men on both sides watched. No one moved, no one drew. The fire crackled. The wind carried the scent of burning paper and dry timber. Willa did not look away. She let it burn until the heat reached her fingers. Then she closed the ledger. She set it on the step. She unfastened the satchel, pulled out the strongbox key, placed it beside the ashes. She turned to the crowd gathered at the edge of the square: farmers, widows, store clerks, men who had lost water rights, women who had lost fences. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The valley will not bleed for what was taken. Her words were quiet, plain. They carried across the dust. The land belongs to those who work it, not to those who hold the gun. She reached into the satchel again, pulled out the remaining deeds, stiff paper, folded tight. She walked down the steps, handed the first to the miller boy. He took it with shaking hands. She handed the next to the Carson widow, then to the homesteader from the eastern ridge, one by one. The paper passed through dust-covered palms. The crowd shifted, shoulders straightened, eyes lifted. No one cheered, no one spoke. The weight of the moment settled over them like a heavy blanket. Willa turned back to the steps. Her father stood at the edge of his men. His hat was pulled low. His coat hung loose. His hands rested at his sides. He did not reach for his revolver. He did not speak. He just watched the ash drift onto the wood. He watched his name turn to smoke. Willa met his eyes. The air between them felt thick, charged. Years of silence pressed down, years of orders given in the dark, years of blood spilled for a ridge no one owned. I won't carry it anymore. She kept her voice low, steady. I won't watch the valley burn for pride. He looked at her, really looked. The lines around his eyes deepened. The hard set of his jaw softened just a fraction. He saw the scar on her sleeve, the dust on her boots, the quiet strength in her posture. He saw the daughter who had dragged a lawman into the dark, who had walked through the creek, who had stood in the rain with deputies, who had carried the weight of a county on her ribs. He did not nod. He did not smile. He only exhaled, slow, heavy. The tension in his shoulders broke. His hands dropped. The men behind him shifted, rifles lowered. The standoff did not end with a shout. It ended with a breath. The marshal stepped forward, boots quiet on the wood. He looked at the ash, at the deeds in the crowd. At Willa, at her father. He tipped his hat just once. The valley is yours to keep. His voice was rough, grounded. No more seizures, no more raids. The law will hold the line. Willa felt the weight lift from her chest, just a fraction, enough to breathe, enough to stand. She looked at the crowd, at the men, at the women holding the deeds like fragile things. The gunfire never came. The silence that followed was heavier than any shot. It settled into the dust, into the wood, into the bones of the square. It marked the end of a violent era, the beginning of a frontier that would finally breathe. Willa stepped back from the steps. The ash coated her boots. The heat pressed against her skin. The old wound along her ribs ached, but it was a quiet ache, a familiar one. She turned toward the road. Toward the ridge, toward the cabin that no longer held a trapdoor. She walked alone, but she did not feel alone. The valley had shifted, the ground had moved, and she had paid the price. She carried the silence with her, she carried the cost, she carried the truth, and the road ahead was hers to walk. The years did not arrive with fanfare. They came like the seasons, slow, steady, unavoidable. Spring rain washed the ash from the courthouse steps. Summer heat baked the new fence lines straight. Autumn winds carried the scent of cut timber and turned leaves across the valley. Winter snow settled on the ridge, soft and quiet, hiding the old trail marks beneath a clean white sheet. Willa watched it all from the porch. Her hands were different now, calloused from soil, not from rope. Fingers stained with earth, not with blood. She knelt in the garden beds, pulling weeds from around tomato vines and sagebrush. The wood beneath her boots was weathered gray, smooth from years of sun and rain. Where the trapdoor once sat, a low stone border now held a patch of rosemary and wild mint. She pressed a seed into the dirt, covered it, watered it. The can was heavy. The water ran clear, it soaked into the soil. She sat back on her heels, wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. The porch creaked. The wind moved through the cottonwoods at the edge of the yard. It carried no warnings, no hoofbeats, no distant powder smoke. It carried the sound of a child laughing, the thud of a wooden ball against a fence post, the steady rhythm of a land at work. She looked down the hill. The old canyon trail was gone, replaced by a graded dirt road. Cattle moved behind woven wire, not scattered, not stolen, counted, marked, tended. Homestead roofs rose in the distance. Chimneys straight, fences unbroken, fields green with winter wheat. She remembered the drought, the ash-choked skies, the desperate alliances over dwindling water. She remembered the ledger, the fire, the ash on her boots, the silence on the courthouse steps. She remembered her father's eyes. The way his shoulders dropped, The way he turned his horse and rode toward the high ridge without a word. He had not spoken since. He had not needed to. The valley had spoken for him. The wind shifted. A wooden sign creaked on a nail. It read Vance Creek in faded black paint, not a claim. A name, a boundary, a promise kept. She stood slowly, joints stiff, muscles tired but steady. She walked to the porch rail, leaned against it, watched the children play near the well. 2 boys, a girl with braided hair. They ran without looking over their shoulders. They did not flinch at shadows. They did not listen for boots on the porch. They just ran, laughing, falling, getting up, running again. She felt the old scar along her ribs. It did not burn anymore. It just rested. A quiet reminder. A line drawn in the dirt that had finally held. She closed her eyes, listened to the wind, to the creek below, to the distant sound of a hammer striking wood, a new barn going up, a fence being repaired, a life being built, not on stolen ground, on chosen ground. She opened her eyes. The sun dipped below the ridge, painted the sky in long, slow strokes of gold and violet. The air cooled, the shadows stretched, the valley breathed. She turned back to the garden, watered the seeds one more time, set the can down, wiped her hands on her apron, sat on the porch steps, watched the light fade. The trapdoor was gone, the ledger was ash, the name was changed, but the land remained, and so did the quiet. She did not speak, she did not pray, she just sat in the stillness, in the peace. In the consequence of a single defiant act, the wind carried no more warnings, only the steady rhythm of a world healed, only the soft sound of a daughter who refused to bleed for pride, only the quiet truth that mercy outlasts the gun. She stayed until the stars appeared, until the crickets began their song, until the valley slept. And when the night finally settled, she rose, went inside, closed the door, left the porch empty, left the garden to the dark, left the story to the wind. The end was not loud, it was not grand, it was just quiet, and it was enough. If this trail resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to keep these frontier stories alive. Every click helps us carry more tales of quiet courage, hard choices, and the kind of mercy that outlasts the gun. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what part of Willa's journey stayed with you. Whether you're under western skies or listening across the water, your voice helps this valley keep breathing. The road ahead holds more dust, more hard miles, and more truths worth telling. Walk it with us, subscribe, leave your mark below, keep the fire burning.